Welcome to the debate. Today, we are opening a file that has been marked, classified in the court of public opinion for over 2 decades now. It's a story that sits comfortably at this really uncomfortable intersection of national security, mental health, and, the eternal nagging human search for what lies beyond our planet. We are looking at the case of a man who, depending on which side of the Atlantic and which side of the law you stand on, is either a dangerous cyber terrorist who paralyzed the U.S. military during its most vulnerable hour, or a modern-day digital archaeologist who was nearly destroyed for asking the wrong questions. We are talking, of course, about Gary McKinnon.
Right, the UFO hacker. It's a headline that almost sounds like a B-movie title from the 50s. But the reality, as we are going to discuss today, is far from fiction. This involves the single largest military computer hack of all time, a diplomatic standoff that spanned a decade, and really a fundamental question about how we define intent in the digital age.
Precisely. And the core question we were wrestling with here isn't just, did he do it? Because he admits he did. He has never denied being on those machines. The question is, was Gary McKinnon a malicious actor threatening the state? Or was he a naive, truth-seeking explorer who stumbled upon gross government negligence? I argue the latter. I see a man driven by a very specific curiosity, whose actions were those of an explorer rather than a destroyer.
And I come at it from a very different way. I think the narrative around McKinnon has been heavily romanticized, almost to the point of absurdity. I argue that he was a reckless cyber vandal, and we cannot excuse the genuine quantifiable damage he caused to critical infrastructure just because he claims he was looking for little green men.
I see why you frame it that way. And the context of the damage is crucial, and we will get to that. But first, to judge the action, I really think we have to understand the actor. Let's look at the profile here. Gary McKinnon was born in Glasgow in 1966, raised in London by a single mother. He wasn't a spy. He wasn't some agent of a foreign power. He was a man who, from a very young age, showed signs of deep social isolation and, obsession.
Which isn't uncommon in the early tech scene. The lone wolf coder is a trope for a reason. True. But this went much deeper. He found refuge in the logic of 8-bit computers. When his family got a microcomputer in 1980, he learned basic programming. For Gary, code was a safe haven. It was this world where instructions produced predictable results, completely unlike the messy, confusing social world he just couldn't navigate. But the catalyst for the events we're discussing wasn't just boredom or the thrill of the hack. It was specifically the Disclosure Project on May 9th, 2001.
That was the press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, right? Where they brought out all the whistleblowers?
Correct. Gary watched testimony from over 20 witnesses. You had retired Air Force, intelligence officers, aviation experts, all going on record to say the government was suppressing UFO technology. But one testimony in particular obsessed him. Donna Hare. She was a former NASA subcontractor, and she claimed that in Building 8 of the Johnson Space Center, there was a specific lab where NASA technicians were airbrushing UFOs out of high-resolution satellite photos before they were released to the public.
And that is the hook.
That was the spark. Gary didn't hack to destroy systems or steal money. He hacked to verify a claim. He genuinely believed the truth was sitting in a digital folder in Building 8. And if the government left the door unlocked, he felt he had a moral right to open it.
See, that is where I have to pull the brakes. You are framing this as a moral crusade, almost heroic. But let's look at the methodology and the scale. The U.S. Department of Justice didn't see a crusade. They saw a firestorm. Between 2001 and 2002, McKinnon hacked into 97 computers. We aren't talking about a library website or a public forum here. We are talking about the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, the Air Force, the Department of Defense, and NASA.
I don't dispute the number of machines. It was undeniably extensive.
But the timing is what makes this indefensible. The bulk of these intrusions happened immediately following September 11, 2001. The smoke was literally still clearing from the World Trade Center. The U.S. military was on the highest possible alert status, and into this tense, incredibly volatile network environment comes Gary McKinnon. And he wasn't just looking.
The DOJ cited nearly $900,000 in damages. That is the cost of cleaning up the mess, securing the networks, and dealing with the downtime.
I want to push back on the definition of hacking and damage here, because it is crucial for our listeners to understand how he actually got in. When we hear biggest military hack of all time, we imagine sophisticated zero-day exploits, encryption cracking, maybe a team of guys in hoodies typing furiously against a firewall. Gary McKinnon used a commercial software called Remotely Anywhere.
Which is a legitimate system administration tool. It's what IT support uses to fix your printer remotely.
Exactly. Gary wrote a simple Perl script, essentially a small automated program, to just scan military IP ranges. He wasn't looking for code vulnerabilities. He was looking for blank passwords. He was looking for default settings that administrators had simply failed to change. He found hundreds of machines, high-level military servers, protected by absolutely nothing. No password, just user, admin, and hit enter.
Which is shocking negligence. I totally agree. It's embarrassing for the Pentagon. But walking through an unlocked door into the Pentagon is still trespassing. And he didn't just walk in. He installed that software remotely anywhere onto those government machines. He effectively installed a back door so he could come and go as he pleased. That takes it from stumbling in to occupation.
But look at his digital footprint. This speaks directly to his intent. He often logged in from his own home in London, sometimes without even masking his IP address. He operated with the clumsiness of an amateur, or perhaps someone who genuinely didn't think he was doing anything wrong. He viewed himself almost as a sloppy sysadmin, pointing out flaws to other sloppy sysadmins. He even left messages.
He did. And those messages are exactly why I struggle with the naive explorer defense. He signed off his solo. He left notes on military servers saying, "Your security is crap." But he also wrote, "U.S. foreign policy is akin to state-sponsored terrorism." And most damningly, he wrote, "I will continue to disrupt at the highest level." That isn't a friendly heads up from a concerned citizen. That is a threat. That is the language of a hacktivist with a delusion of grandeur.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it a bit differently. Solo sounds like someone trying to role-play a character, perhaps to feel more powerful than he actually was in real life. Remember, he was unemployed, sitting in a dark room in London, totally obsessed with finding these files. The political commentary was certainly a reaction to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which he opposed. But does expressing a political opinion in a text file turn a nuisance hacker into a terrorist?
It establishes motive for the damage. If you say, "I will disrupt," and then the network goes down, we have to take you at your word. And regarding his sophistication, he operated almost exclusively at night, UK time. To the Americans, this looked like stealth. He was active when the offices were empty. He installed that remote control software specifically to maintain access. He was setting up shop inside the Pentagon's network. That isn't stumbling through an open door. That is changing the lock so you can come back and rifle through the drawers whenever you want.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it ignores the lifestyle of the man. His stealth was simply his sleeping pattern. He was obsessed, living on the internet at night, because that's when phone rates were cheaper and the dial-up connection was more stable. But let's pivot to what he actually found. Because if we accept his intent was to find the Disclosure Project evidence, we have to look at his claims. This is the part of the story that has kept the forums alive for 20 years.
The mythology of the non-terrestrial officers.
The specific details are what make it so interesting. Gary claims that on a U.S. Navy computer, he found an Excel spreadsheet. The file name was an alien's. It was listed under a directory for non-terrestrial officers. Inside, he saw a list of names and ranks, and another column labeled fleet-to-fleet transfers. Now, non-terrestrial is a very specific, highly bureaucratic term. It's extremely unlikely to be a typo for naval officer.
Okay, let's apply some Occam's razor here. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that this proves anything extraterrestrial. Non-terrestrial sounds exotic to a civilian. In a military context, terrestrial means land-based. Non-terrestrial could easily refer to assets stationed at sea, or much more likely the emerging Space Command officers managing satellites or data relays. Fleet to fleet is standard naval terminology. You don't need spaceships to have a fleet. You need destroyers and carriers.
That's a valid skepticism, and one that is frankly hard to refute without the file itself. But Gary insists the names didn't match any known public military personnel. And then there is the image. He navigated to Building 8's network, exactly where Donna Hare said to go. He found folders labeled processed and unprocessed. He tried to open a raw, unprocessed image.
On a 56K dial-up modem.
Right. For our younger listeners, we are talking about a connection speed where an image loads line by line, from top to bottom over the course of minutes. Gary describes watching the screen. He sees the black of space, then the curve of the Earth, and then, hovering above the hemisphere, a distinct cigar-shaped object. No rivets, no seams, no exhaust.
And then?
And then the connection died. He claims someone at the terminal saw the mouse moving because, remember, remotely anywhere actually takes over the screen, and they physically pulled the plug or severed the connection. He didn't get to save it.
Which is incredibly convenient, isn't it? The fish that got away. The problem with this evidence is that it exists solely in Gary McKinnon's memory. There was no screenshot, there was no downloaded file. We're asked to believe that he found the holy grail of ufology, but failed to hit print screen before the connection was cut. To me, this sounds like a man who stared at grainy pixels until he saw what he desperately wanted to see.
Or it speaks to the immense difficulty of exfiltrating data on a dial-up connection while under the adrenaline stress of committing a federal crime. But the U.S. government certainly treated him like he had seen something important. They didn't treat him like a prankster. This brings us to the legal aftermath, which is really where this story shifts from a tech drama to a human rights landmark.
The extradition battle. This defined UK-US relations for a decade. The U.S. invoked the 2003 Extradition Act. Their argument was incredibly simple. The crime happened on U.S. servers. The victims were the U.S. military. The damage was paid for by U.S. taxpayers. Therefore, the trial should be in the U.S.
But the 2003 Act was highly controversial. It was widely seen as asymmetric. It allowed the U.S. to demand extradition from the U.K. with very little supporting evidence, essentially just reasonable suspicion. Whereas if the U.K. wanted to extradite someone from the U.S., they needed to meet a much higher standard of probable cause. Gary was caught right in this diplomatic imbalance.
The Crown Prosecution Service in the UK actually declined to prosecute him domestically in 2006. They effectively cleared the path for the Americans. The logic was that the harm was located in Virginia and New Jersey, not London.
And that decision completely ignored the human reality. It wasn't until 2006, 6 years after the initial arrest, that Gary was formally diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which is a form of autism.
And I have to ask, why did it take 6 years? To a cynical observer, or certainly to a U.S. prosecutor, this looked like a Hail Mary defense strategy. He's facing 70 years in a U.S. federal prison, and suddenly a medical diagnosis appears that frames him as a vulnerable victim rather than a criminal mastermind. It looked like a tactic to avoid the consequences of his actions.
I strongly disagree with the cynicism there. High-functioning autism was very often missed in adults back then. The diagnosis actually explained everything. It explained the obsessive focus on UFOs, the ability to spend 18 hours a day scanning IP addresses without eating or sleeping. It explained the social naivete, why he left notes signed solo, and why he spoke so openly to the police without a lawyer initially. He lacked the theory of mind to understand how his actions would be perceived by the military. He honestly thought if he just explained he was looking for aliens, they would say, "Oh, okay, never mind."
Even if we accept the diagnosis, the legal question remained. Does having Asperger's grant you immunity from extradition? The UK High Court repeatedly said no. They received diplomatic assurances from the U.S. that Gary would get medical care in prison. They were ready to put him on a plane.
But the medical experts, independent ones, warned that extradition would be a death sentence, not because of the prison conditions per se, but because Gary's mental state was so fragile that removing him from his support system would almost certainly lead to suicide. This is where Theresa May stepped in.
October 2012.
Yes. As Home Secretary, she made a historic decision. She blocked the extradition. She cited Article 3 of the Human Rights Act, which is the prohibition of inhuman or degrading treatment. She stated explicitly, Mr. McKinnon's extradition would give rise to such a high risk of him ending his life that a decision to extradite would be incompatible with Mr. McKinnon's human rights.
It was a victory for Gary, certainly, but it left a bitter taste for many in the justice system. It created a perception of a double standard. If a Muslim man had hacked the Pentagon and left notes about U.S. foreign policy, would he have been saved by a diagnosis of Asperger's? Or was Gary protected because he was a quirky British eccentric looking for aliens? It seemed to suggest that if your motive is weird enough, you get a pass.
I think it demonstrated that the law must have the capacity for mercy and nuance. It forced a change in the law. Because of Gary McKinnon, the UK introduced the form bar. This allows judges to refuse extradition if a significant part of the conduct occurred in the UK, and it is in the interest of justice to try the person here. That protects future defendants from being shipped off automatically.
That is true. It modernized the legal framework for cybercrime, acknowledging that in the internet age, a crime can happen everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. But before we conclude, we really have to talk about the Earl Naval Base. This is the part of the story that usually gets glossed over by his supporters, and it relates directly to the damage claim.
The weapon logs.
Yes, the Naval Weapons Station Earl in New Jersey. This base is responsible for restocking the Atlantic Fleet's munitions. McKinnon's intrusion into their system occurred right as the Navy was mobilizing post 9/11. The government alleges that he deleted critical weapons logs files that tracked the location and quantity of munitions. The result was that the Atlantic Fleet supply chain was paralyzed for days. Trucks couldn't move, ships couldn't load. In a time of war, that is not exploration, that is sabotage.
That is a very serious allegation, but it's one Gary has consistently denied. He admits to being in the system, but he totally denies deleting those logs. His argument raises a fascinating possibility, the crowded room theory. He claims that when he was on these networks, he wasn't alone. Because the security was so non-existent, literally blank passwords, he reported seeing other connections from other foreign IP addresses.
It wasn't me, it was the other guy. I mean, it's the oldest excuse in the book.
But is it implausible? If he could get in with a simple script, surely Chinese, Russian, or other state actors could too. Gary suggests the government might have panicked and wiped the systems themselves while trying to secure the breach, or that a malicious actor was present simultaneously. He was the loud one, the one leaving notes, so he became the convenient scapegoat for all the damage.
That feels like convenient deflection. The National Infrastructure Protection Center did a forensic analysis. They correlated the deletion of files specifically with the times McKinnon was logged in and the tools he was using. Whether he hit delete maliciously or whether his installation of the remote software corrupted the files is almost irrelevant to the outcome. He broke the system. He blocked the ammo supply. If that had happened a month earlier, it could have impacted the response to 9/11 directly.
I think we have to agree to disagree on the intent there. I see negligence on the part of the Navy for leaving the door opened. You see malice on the part of the intruder. But we must look at the legacy. Gary McKinnon never faced trial. The CPS dropped the UK case in December 2012. He lives a quiet life now, restricted from technology, still dealing with the psychological scars of 10 years of terror.
The obsession led him down a rabbit hole that nearly cost him his life. He didn't find the smoking gun, or if he did, he failed to capture it. He left the world with unverified stories and a legacy of damaged infrastructure. He showed us that the truth isn't worth destroying your own reality.
That's a valid takeaway, but let me offer a different perspective. Gary McKinnon exposed a dual truth. First, he shattered the illusion of military digital invincibility. He showed that the emperor had no clothes, or at least no firewalls. He forced the US government to spend millions securing networks that should have been secure already.
He was a stress test that went too far.
And secondly, regarding the UFO question, even if he didn't bring back the file, the phrase non-terrestrial officers has entered the lexicon. It continues to fuel the demand for transparency. It forces us to ask, what does the military know that they aren't telling us?
It fuels the mythology. We are left with a story of a man who broke into the vault, claims he saw the gold, but came back empty-handed. We have to ask ourselves, is the story of the cigar-shaped craft a revelation, or is it a hallucination born of exhaustion and desire?
And that ambiguity is perhaps the most compelling part. We have the logs of the hack, but we don't have the logs of the aliens. Gary McKinnon remains a figure suspended between two worlds, the criminal and the visionary.
And a reminder that if you leave your digital backdoor open, someone, whether they want to destroy you or just verify a rumor, is eventually going to walk in.
A sobering thought for the digital age. Thank you for listening to The Debate.
Until next time.